There's a lot happening in ReZero right now. Amelia and Felt have been captured, Priscilla and Otto are nowhere to be found, Garfiel has to help his mother find his siblings, then Subaru and the others need to free the city from its captors. They're all events going on simultaneously, and that doesn't even include the smaller storylines of the side characters. So, while Season 4 does switch things up with the way the story is presented, the way it bounces around actually kinda works. It makes sure we're relatively updated with the status of everyone, all while maintaining focus on that bigger overarching conflict. This does come at the cost of some additional depth though, so where we should have gotten more info on Capella, Al, and some others, we instead kept our focus on the main cast. It leaves quite a bit to cover in just one episode of cut content. So, rather than do one long half-hour video, this one will be split into parts. First, the extended meeting and Garfiel's conflict, then after that the operation and how it really went down. Both have some pretty interesting details you're probably going to want to know about. But first, have you ever wanted to form your own dream team of iconic heroes and villains? Well, now you can with today's sponsor, Marvel Strike Force. In this dynamic squad-based RPG, everyone from Thanos and the various Spider-Men, all the way to my personal favorites of Ronin and Taskmaster, can be assembled together to fight in combat. You can even get Agatha Harkness for free just by using my link or QR code to download it now. As for what you do with them, whether it's taking on Doctor Doom or Apocalypse in the campaign, fighting against other players in the arena, or even taking part in the massive weekly alliance battle of raids in the Cosmic Crucible, there's always new ways to battle with your roster. You'll recruit the classics like Iron Man, Wolverine, and Venom, level them up and complete missions, then unlock gear which you'll use in the best selection of PvE and PvP modes. Team synergy is absolutely essential too, so you're gonna want to keep a close eye on the team comps you make. Like, the X-Men and Avengers will buff each other while the Annihilators and Kree will gain resistances. This is just barely scratching the surface, but there's a genuinely surprising amount of depth with the tactics involved. So, if you start today, you can get 17 characters free within 30 days on top of the Agatha Harkness that they're giving out this month. She's just one of the many new characters they're always coming out with, the next of which will actually be Blade and his Night Stalkers. So, if you're interested in that, the strategic gameplay or just the expansive Marvel multiverse, then I highly recommend giving Marvel Strike Force a try. Once you do, you can redeem promo code Halloween to get 100 free shards for Zombie Iron Man, 600,000 gold, and 480 L2 training modules. All you gotta do is download the game for free using my link in the description or the QR code. But anyway, Episode 54 Part 1, Witch Cult Disaster Response Headquarters, covering chapters 3 and 4 from volume 17 of the light novel. With Capella's name being revealed as the culprit behind everything, Subaru was both surprised and unsurprised. Surprised because Capella was an archbishop he's never heard of before, and unsurprised because knowing her identity was a given at this point. If there was one golden rule these deranged archbishops always followed, it was the fact they always introduced themselves before doing anything. It was as if they all had this desire to stand in the spotlight. Now, there were a few logistical questions Subaru wanted answered, like why was it that a business was being used as a disaster response headquarters? Based on what he knew about companies in general, it wasn't normal for them to turn their place of business into a shelter like this. Well, as it turns out, the main reason is because the building was owned by Kiritaka. The person Subaru didn't really think too fondly of was actually a lot more considerate than he may have thought. Reason being that, as the leading member of the city's Council of 10, it only made sense to look out for the people he was responsible for. He was actively assisting with the evacuation himself, all while taking time to properly dispatch those who could assist even further. So, if even Krush and Wilhelm are vouching for his character, then Subaru knew Kiritaka might not be as bad as he thought. In fact, if not for Kiritaka and his quick decision to turn his business into a makeshift field hospital, there was a good chance Felix wouldn't have been able to save Subaru's leg at all. So, it was in that way that Subaru actually kind of owed him one. Al had even gone so far as to refer to this as lucky, but for Subaru he knew luck had nothing to do with it. If it did, then Subaru felt he wouldn't have died multiple times to get to this point. To him, he just wasn't the type to believe in fortune anymore. He had stopped doing so ever since the day he was isekai'd here. The group then went on to discuss the people not present, starting with the most obvious, Priscilla. As a royal princess candidate herself, you'd think Al would be more worried about her safety, but in actuality he wasn't too concerned at all. Yes, he was a bit scared, but that was mostly for himself since Priscilla was gonna punish him for sure. There was no way she wouldn't, considering his lack of presence during such a crucial time like this. Julius and Ricardo had escorted Felix here, then immediately left to go check up on other shelters. Their plan was to contact Felix should they find anyone who needed his help, all so they could save at least one more person. The whole thing made perfect sense to Subaru, except for the part about contacting Felix. Reason being that in a world where the total count of cell phones was 1, the conversation mirror media was quite the surprise for Subaru. I mean, with the way Felix pulled it out as if it was the most common thing to exist, that even went to catch me off guard. As it turns out though, the mirror was actually a spoil of war from last year's battle against Betelgeuse. It was something Anastasia had been keeping ever since. Its full capabilities allowed it to connect to 3 other mirrors just like it, so all in all it was quite the useful tool for communication. Now, Otto's whereabouts wasn't too much of a concern for Subaru, since when it came to staying alive, he was second to none. When all was said and done, Subaru truly believed he was the last person to slip up in a situation like this. It wasn't something he'd willingly admit out loud, but that was the glowing opinion Subaru had of him. This is actually pretty similar to the feelings Al has towards Priscilla, since just like Subaru with regards to Otto, Al trusted she could take care of herself too. It just wasn't something he was very open to admitting either. Now, when it came to the others in the Amelia camp, Subaru believed Garfiel was probably fine too, and Patrash was sharp enough to take care of herself. She was currently safe at an inn settled up alongside Frufu. The one party whose absence was a bit worrying though was Felt and her missing knight Reinhard. The last anyone had seen from either of them was Felt running after the person who ruined their mornings. It was a thought that caused Wilhelm to tense up a bit. Obviously, if Reinhardt was with her though, then her safety wasn't really anything to worry about. So after every absentee was thought about and accounted for, the only wildcards were Priscilla and the songstress. There was no telling where the two of them could have run off together. Getting back to the main problem at hand, the archbishops were essentially holding 100,000 people hostage. As one of the 5 largest cities in Lagunica, it made evacuating everyone almost impossible. Sure, they could technically do it by walking right out the main gate, but with an enemy-controlled control tower right next to it, being discreet just wasn't feasible. It was a dire situation Subaru was surprisingly calm about, since only a year ago he would have been freaking out about saving Amelia. As someone who's grown from his experiences though, he now knew losing his cool wouldn't save anyone. His last outburst already caused Amelia to get abducted, so that was a mistake he was desperately trying to avoid again. It was an admirable notion that really resonated with Wilhelm. For some personal reason or the other, he was very invested in helping Subaru and Amelia. So while Wilhelm's support came as quite the comfort for Subaru, for Al, who was watching the whole interaction go down, he seemed interested for a completely different reason. He didn't say a word the entire time it was happening, but the way he stared made it seem like he wanted to say something. It was enough to get Subaru to ask what it was. Al didn't have any reason in particular, but he did say how he was thinking Subaru was pretty twisted. It was a vague response that came with all sorts of implications. Subaru couldn't figure out what those were right now, but the off-putting nature of it made Subaru more wary of Al. This brings us now to the discussion about Capella, where quite a bit more was given for her backstory. Not the Capella we know as the Archbishop though, but instead the Capella who Lust stole her name from. So, aside from succumbing to illness at a very young age, it turns out her death wasn't mourned by anyone. Where normally a state funeral would be held and a formal ceremony put on, neither were done since the people had no desire to. The excuse was that the times were too dire, but in actuality it was simply because no one liked her. So, the processions which were hers by right were completely ignored due to the cruel sadistic nature that she was known for. Apparently, wherever she went, an unfathomable darkness always seemed to follow. It's for this reason her death was even kept secret for a while, and that to Wilhelm will forever be one of the kingdom's greatest indignities. It clearly wasn't something he was comfortable talking about. At least now everyone knew Lust couldn't be the old Capella, so to Wilhelm it was likely she was just trying to harass those who did know her. Perhaps to invite suspicion or simply lay mistrust, but either way, it was a disrespectful act that clearly intended to disparage the royal family. Something Krusch and Wilhelm weren't very willing to just accept. The one who was affected by it the most though was actually Felix, who was now very visibly angry. It was rather rare for anyone to see him like this, but the expression Felix made now was one of pure, genuine anger. As a royal guard whose sole purpose was to protect the royal family, such disrespect was desecration of the highest order. That was the apparent reason for his rage on the surface, but there was something else too clearly bothering him. Something that didn't have anything to do with fealty or the kingdom. Now, there wasn't any point trying to understand the witch cult's intentions, since trying to do so was likely just a waste of time. The most important thing right now was figuring out how to navigate this. They knew what they wanted and what was at risk, so all they needed to do now was figure out the best path forward. The whole thing was actually so out of character for the witch cult, since to see them use hostages as a means to an end, well, that was a level of logic and rationality Subaru just wasn't accustomed to for them. As for what they wanted, the witch's bones were something Subaru couldn't initially fathom either. With Satella supposedly slumbering in a land far away to the east, the thought of her leaving her bones as a relic just didn't make sense to him, especially with her statement about how she wanted Subaru to kill her. That made him adamant that she couldn't be dead, leading to a visible panic at just the thought of it. Her words and his promise forced him to reject any possibility that Satella could be dead. That's when Al would interject saying that it could be other witches, eventually leading to his subtle statement about Tifon. It was a name he didn't expect to hear coming from him, but one he hoped to inquire about if he ever got the opportunity. Given how cryptic he was when he said it though, it was another instance where Subaru believed Al knew more than he was letting on. So he was very curious to know if the youthful girl he met was the same one Al was deep in thought about. If it was, then the thought of her demise being used as the foundation for this city really was rather unsettling. The rest of the meeting went pretty much the same, aside from a minor scene with Anastasia taking a hard stance against terrorism. Knowing the witch cult would just kill them should they give in to their demands, she was pretty adamant about not negotiating with them at all. It made it so the only two options were to fight or flee. It was then that Garfiel would arrive with Mimi, leading to the flashback explaining how it all happened. A tragic turn of events starting of course with Capella. So, as she introduced both herself and her vivid disdain for humans, the unsettling nature of it all caused Mimi's smile to disappear. It made her carry an expression Garfiel knew didn't belong on her face, and for some reason that made him very uncomfortable. This was of course signed to regroup with Subaru and Amelia, but not before first encountering Liara. What happened next was a deep internal conflict between what he needed to do and what he wanted to do. You see, he was caught between fulfilling his duty to the Subaru and Amelia camp or helping his mother and the siblings he just recently discovered. It was a decision that brought into question who he was and everything he valued in life. Like, if he wasn't with Subaru and Amelia, then what use was he to them? At the same time, his two siblings were still technically his family, so it wouldn't be right to turn his back on them either. So, what had finally pushed Garfiel over the edge was Liara's pitiful attempt to convince him not to help. After seeing just how hesitant Garfiel was, she quickly understood it wasn't right for her to ask him this. It was a reaction that reminded Garfiel of the day she left him. Just like how she did back then, she was clearly trying not to saddle others with duties they weren't obligated to take on. Heartfelt consideration that immediately made Garfiel's choice obvious. Of course, Garfiel knew he couldn't saddle Mimi with those obligations either, but as soon as he told her not to tag along, Mimi quickly made it clear that she was gonna help too. Both were decisions Liara simply couldn't understand right now. Given how to her he was just a stranger, it didn't make sense why he would go so far for her. It was when she finally asked that the only answer Garfiel could give was that he was the Golden Tiger. That was all he said before jumping away to fulfill his promise. In the end, Garfiel knew putting off his duties was reckless, but what he found while doing so was that following his heart was easiest. Rather than wrestle with this incredibly tough decision now, he decided to instead focus on what was in front of him, then think through what had happened later. It was the way of fighting the Amelia faction had taught him. Why choose one when you can just take everything? Now, as for where the kids were, their lingering scent revealed they had gone to the park to see the songstress. This meant they were likely in a nearby shelter, one that in order to get to they first needed to pass City Hall, the location of Liara's husband and the center of Lust's operations. This presented Garfiel with yet another tough decision, since he could either ignore the man who stole his mother and go find his siblings, or try and save him and maintain his mother's newfound happy lifestyle. He was, after all, the one who saved her life. So, though Garfiel wasn't connected to him by blood, he understood the impact of losing Gallic wasn't something he could just overlook. As someone who knew all too well himself, a blank space in the family was one that could never be filled. So Garfiel, being Garfiel, decided right there that going for the source of the commotion was best. If he could beat Capella right now, then everything should resolve itself faster. It was logic that made complete sense to Mimi, but at the same time had her intuition ringing all sorts of alarm bells. Garf knew he needed to be careful too, but based on what he knew about witches from his time in Sanctuary, when it came to strength, he wasn't worried at all. Yes, he understood they had quite a bit of power, but from what he could tell about the one in Sanctuary, he honestly felt that she would never beat him in a contest of strength. It was a mindset that gave him confidence in his ability to fight lust. So, after equipping his shields and gearing up, that's when him and Mimi would finally approach City Hall like how we saw in the anime. His plan was to overwhelm the enemy with speed and violence. He figured that this was the best approach, since from what he was told about Subaru's encounter with the witch cult in the past, the Archbishop's disciples weren't really anything to worry about. Yes, there were quite a few of them, but individually, each weren't very strong at all. They were a problem he figured he could just handle on the fly. What Garfiel came across instead, though, was a pair with an aura so incredibly hostile that just being in their presence was enough to understand these were masters who've stepped beyond the realm of mere mortals. To compare them to an opponent we would understand ourselves, each was equal to, if not stronger than Elsa. They were enough of a threat to know facing them unprepared would be suicide. This was a fact Garfiel fully understood, but getting himself to accept it was a completely different story. Reason being that, to him, they were nothing but a wall he needed to challenge and overcome. Since his strength was the only thing he had pride in, to turn tail and run after just losing in strength to Reinhardt, well, that was simply unacceptable to him. Now, the fight itself was relatively similar, but to highlight some of Garfiel's thoughts throughout, he was genuinely shocked by how light the lady was. When his foot made contact and pushed her away, he was thrown back by just how light she felt. It was here that Garf's greediness would proceed to get the best of him, since where he thought he could at least take out one, instead turned into him getting jumped by both. He was bombarded by an onslaught of perfectly refined swordsmanship from the woman and crude heavy blows from the giant. One flowed like water through a river, while the other destroyed like a storm, ravaging everything. It was a mind-numbing beatdown that Garfiel could barely keep up with. The only reason he was able to avoid death at all was because instinct alone helped him to parry the hits that would have been fatal. Everything else he just took head on. Now, something that really stood out to me after this was Elsa's line, which translated differently in the novel. Rather than her saying she's gonna kill him, that love for Garfiel instead came from the fact he killed her. Or rather, will kill her. Both didn't really make much sense to me, but what they represent is the invitation of death. Either way, the battle would continue with Mimi having to save Garfiel, eventually resulting in Mimi's injury. They could have gotten away had Garfiel stuck to the plan, but because he was so caught up in trying to be the strongest, he would now have to face the direct consequences of his actions, the near death of the person who helped him cry. So, the moment Garfiel realized that she was injured, he quickly found somewhere safe, then set her down so he could try and heal her himself. This was something he'd spent the last year learning, since if anything happened to those from Sanctuary, he wanted more than anything to be able to help them. It was for this reason he put his heart and soul into learning healing magic, and this moment right here was about to prove his efforts. It was the exact situation that he'd been preparing for. When the wound he was treating didn't end up closing though, despair and desperation overwhelmed him. All that time he'd spent learning how to treat wounds just like this was completely useless in the moment it mattered most. What should have been an opportunity to show how far he'd come was instead turned into yet another failure. So, as he panicked more and started speaking his thoughts out loud, Garfiel didn't even recognize the voice of the person talking anymore. It was so frail and weak that it couldn't be his. This was no time to wallow in his own despair though, since what mattered now was saving her. If it meant giving his life in exchange for hers, that was something Garfiel was ready to do in an instant. He kept calling for a miracle as he jumped from rooftop to rooftop again, looking for anything or anyone that could help him. With not a soul in sight though, the only thing Garfield could do now was rely on his senses. It was a last-ditch effort which would eventually lead him to the person he was looking for. The man that to him completely symbolized miracles. He was the personification of hope in the most dire of situations. So, if anyone was going to be able to save Mimi, the general in front of him was the person to do it. Now, the next part pretty much segues into the operation to retake City Hall, so I think right here is a good place to stop. You can expect that video in a few days or so, or you can come see me talk about it early over on my stream on Sunday. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope to see you at the next. Feel free to like and subscribe if you did. If you missed last episode, then you can watch that here, or if you want to watch Danmachi, then you can do so here. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!